Very good. If we could move on to the next item,
Well, just
which is
now I must ask you to look at the slides, not at me, because there's a lot of bits and pieces moving around on the slideshow here.
so this has been something that's of particular interest to a number of us for
Yes.
a number of years.
Well, any landowner's interested. I've looked at the maps on my farm, and they only make a certain amount of sense, shall we say. Look, I'd like to take you through the findings of one of my latest reports, which is reviewing the use of the LUC system in a regulatory context, and that was published in December. And I've already had a chance to brief the Environment Committee on this, and I'm delighted that I think we were trying to do it jointly. And
I was there.
You were there. Okay, yeah.
I was there, so I'm going to have a second.
Second crack. Okay, it was that good, was it?
It was.
There was, I think they were trying to get a joint meeting and we couldn't get the scheduling, so that's why I'm here separately. Let me start by outlining what the Land Use Capability system is. LUC stands for Land Use Capability. It's a land classification system which was developed in the 1950s. And it was designed to support long-term sustained production on the land. LUC, as many of you know, is made up of 8 classes, 1 to 8, and within each of the classes there are subclasses based on the dominant limitation of productivity. So it's only the dominant limitation. There are 4 limitations. There is erodibility, wetness, soil, and climate. And then within the subclasses there are also units, so it's got a certain level of disaggregation. However, it was never designed to address environmental challenges. So the first question you might ask is, why review the use of the LUC system? Well, for a biological economy like ours, high quality information about the land and wider landscape is critical. And it's also critical for high quality environmental regulation. Now, currently, the LUC system is being relied on to support 3 pieces of national regulation. They are the policy statement for highly productive land, the National Environmental Standard for Commercial Forestry, and the Climate Change Response Act to limit ETS-driven farmed forestry conversion. So those are the 3 current regulatory uses of the system. LUC is also used in 2 regional regulatory plans in the context of water quality and nutrient management. Given that it wasn't designed to address environmental management challenges, but is now being used to support regulation, I thought it was prudent to review whether the system was sufficiently robust to support regulation, and particularly so given that Parliament has a major new planning system in front of the Environment Committee with these 2 bills, planning and natural environment. So the key finding of my review is that the LUC system is ill-suited to regulatory use. This is due to several limitations. The first one is that it's outdated. This is because the main mapping was carried out about half a century ago in the 1970s and 80s. Not surprisingly, things have moved since then. That mapping remains unchanged. It doesn't reflect the situation today. For example, land management practices such as irrigation and drainage directly affect the subclass limitation of wetness. The addition of permanent irrigation can change the LUC unit as the potential created by irrigation wasn't considered during the original assessment in the 1970s and 1980s. Canterbury Plains is a good example of that. At the time of mapping, manual technologies and a high degree of expert judgment were used. Now, that was unavoidable, but it introduced a high degree of subjectivity, particularly into the boundaries between areas. And it's not a criticism. I mean, they did the very best job they could at the time. It's just that we've moved on and we've got new techniques for doing stuff. Second limitation is the coarse scale of the mapping, which makes the national LUC data set inappropriate for use at a property scale. And this is where most of us who own land have immediately rushed to look at what these lines mean, and you know your own farm inside out, and then you look at what the line produces and there seems to be a gap. Well, that's scarcely surprising because the scale of the LUC data set is 1 to 50,000. So every centimetre on a map is 500 metres on the ground. But to make operational or site-based decisions, you need maps at the scale of 1 to 5,000 or 1 to 10,000. So that would be a centimetre on the map equaling 50 or 100 metres. It's, as some of you will know anyhow, that land can change much more frequently than at a 500 metre interval. I can't resist telling you, I just know from my own farm, paddocks which move from being well drained to not so well draining, it happens much more swiftly and much more irregularly than the maps tell you. I've currently got a master's student trying to work out where ancient drainage channels lie under some of my flat paddocks, because that is actually influencing what's going on at the top. And this is all outwash from the Central North Island volcanoes, but it's quite fascinating. But what she's doing is very, very fine-grained. What's happening on the surface doesn't follow the coarse conclusions of LUC, and that would be true everywhere. It's not a criticism of LUC being done, bad. It's what they could do at the time, but we're moving beyond there. Now, let me just outline how these limitations play out in national regulations. And I start with highly productive land. Let's look at a tangible example from the Hawke's Bay, where the council explored different methods to identify highly productive land. Now, the pink colours, and you need to watch these slides to understand this, the pink colours on this map, this is a bit of the Hawke's Bay, you can see Hastings towards the top there. The pink colours show areas which are classed as 1 to 3 under the LUC system. So that's, the rest of it is outside that. Now, the yellow colours on the right-hand map show the class 1 to 3 land that show up when you're using an alternative map. This is using SMAP, which is the digital soil map, okay? And as you can probably just see even with your eyes, they don't match neatly. Now, the teal coloured areas show the overlap between the two. And the overlap is just 41%. So if you used one map, you'd get one set of results. If you used another technique, SMAP, you get another. And the LUC only overlaps with the more sophisticated SMAP 41% of the time. The rest doesn't. Now, it's a very significant disagreement between the data sets. Similar analysis in Canterbury showed even lower agreement of around 21%. Now, the point is that you would need substantial ground truthing to reconcile and validate the two. You'd be ill-advised to solely rely on either of the methods for identification of highly productive land. So in practical terms, if you were concerned that being classed as highly productive could limit your land use options, the lack of overlap could spell real problems for you. These are real regulatory problems caused by inadequate underlying data. Just look at the pink bits south of Hastings. The digital soil map doesn't give these a high status, but the LUC map does. That cuts two ways, depending on which side of the coin you're on as to what you do with your land, but it is a very significant difference. Okay, the second illustration I've chosen of how this LUC system plays out is in respect of the National Environmental Standard on commercial forestry. That standard has been, again, derived from the LUC system using something called an erosion susceptibility classification as a screening tool. And that identifies the erosion susceptibility of land intended for forestry. So it's a threshold test used to determine whether a forest activity is permitted or subject to certain conditions being met, or whether it requires a resource consent outright. So given that erosion from forestry activities is a key environmental issue that the standard is supposed to manage, identifying risky land is critical. That relies on the robustness of the erosion classification and the National Erosion Susceptibility Classification data set, which, as I say, is based on LUC. Unfortunately, the ESC both over and under classifies susceptibility of land to erosion. Obviously, underclassifying land is a problem environmentally because it gives the green light to forestry when maybe more questions should be asked and stricter controls imposed. And you can see what people up in Tairāpiti feel about that. Let's just explore an example, again from the Hawke's Bay. So this map, no, I'm going to go back so I don't distract you. Whoops. This map shows 3 ESC zones. This is erosion susceptibility classification. Green for low erosion susceptibility, orange with high, red with very high. There is a 4th one, which is yellow for medium, but there wasn't any medium on this bit that we chose, okay? So you got 3 of the 4 ESC zones there. And I just, they're nice smooth lines, aren't they? Note the uniformity and the coarseness of these zones. And that just reflects the fact that this data has been collected at 1 to 50,000. Okay, now look at the green zone on the 2nd map. This adds recent research from what used to be called land care research, which reveals that this area contains high areas that are susceptible to landslide and connectivity to waterways. That's shown in red. So that lovely green bit in the top, which we've said is low, it's riddled with red actually, but that's because we've come down to a much more fine-grained resolution. So underclassifying land as a risk because of the more permissive approach that the standard takes to management of that land. And of course, the same can apply the other way around. You can find you've been classified as high susceptibility, but in fact, some of it's green. All comes back to the underlying data. On this 3rd map, we added some additional information which came from Earth Sciences New Zealand, and this shows areas with a greater than 80% probability of rainfall-induced landslides. Again, it shows just how coarse the ESC zones are in comparison with the recent research outputs. So I think it shows the power of newer, finer resolution data. The problem is that we don't have them everywhere. It's a patchwork quilt. The science system has funded CRIs to do a bit here, bit there. But this is something I think for a land-based economy in a country like New Zealand, we should have this absolutely comprehensively. So we can't always stitch information together in the way that we've managed to do here for you. There's bits of New Zealand where you couldn't do that. So that brings me to my recommendations. First, that as a result of the limitations I've outlined, we shouldn't be using LUC for any more regulatory purposes. It's too coarse. This recommendation applies both to national and regional regulation through resource management plans. The use of the national LUC dataset for property scale regulation is particularly problematic. Secondly, the government should invest in progressively improving essential contemporary data sets that underpin land use regulation and ensure that they're publicly available and affordable and can be easily integrated. I mean, there is a lot of information out there. Taxpayers have paid for it, but you may not be able to access it, or it may be expensive if you try. Now, as part of the review, we have identified several such data sets which we think should be made comprehensive. There's LIDAR, which you'll all be familiar with. We've got that over quite a lot of the country, but not everywhere. There's SMAP, which I think we've got to 70% of productive soils. It still leaves 30% of them outside. There's the land cover database. Now that is based on remote sensing, but it's only done every 5.5 years or so. And it's always a case of putting the hat around and trying to find agencies that will help fund it. And then what we don't have at all, but we should have, I'd have thought, was real-time land use mapping. So we know actually what is happening on the surface of the earth now. And you can see, I mean, that's valuable for anyone. It's for absolutely anyone, whether you're a developer, whether you're a council, whether you're trying to write a spatial plan or whatever, knowing what's there now is pretty useful rather than having to rely on bits and pieces of information that may be out of date. And by the way, that's what Parliament looks like if you use LIDAR. There you are.
That's Parliament.
That's Parliament. Yeah, you see, so that's where we are.
Sorry,
now.
what did you use there?
We're in there. That's LIDAR. That's
LiDAR,
just using elevation, nothing else. But it's a that's very fine grained, isn't it? So, third recommendation. these essentially contemporary data sets need to be used to modernise the LUC and ESC system. So I'm not saying you throw them out. They were for productive land purpose identification. So you can modernise those by adding stuff. And where it's suitable, you could create bespoke fit-for-purpose models for specific regulatory purposes. So you can imagine a world in which the government wants to provide national direction on something, and they know they need information to do it. They could say, these are the data sets that need to be used and integrated to provide the information base for regulating. Of course, the databases have to be comprehensive. If they're full of gaps, then it's garbage in, garbage out. Finally, we need to focus improvements in environmental data and information on areas where better information is most urgently needed. Doing this stuff does cost money. You don't try laboriously to do it everywhere all at the same time. So you've got to focus on the hotspots. I would have thought that focusing for some of these, say for instance for the high productivity land one, you'd focus your attention where land is under pressure from urban expansion. So the Aucklands, the Taurongas, the Hamilton, Napier, Hastings, Christchurch, it's the peri-urban situation where you want extremely accurate data. So to conclude, the review highlighted that the LUC system isn't fit for purpose in a regulatory setting, and the limitations of the system are yet another example of a broader issue which I keep drawing to Parliament's attention, and that is the quality of our environmental information. We need better environmental information. It's the foundation of good decision-making by you guys. It's also the foundation of good economic choices by people out there in the marketplace. So it cuts both ways, both from an environmental and an economic point of view. This can only be a valuable investment, and I've been raising it now for 8 years here. Secondly, the new resource management system proposes to make greater use of spatial regulation and environmental limits. You're going to need much better information if you want that system to run properly. So we need something of a step change in information to power that. That's really more for the Environment Committee. But I said to them that I thought their reform risks failing if you don't make the investment that's needed in our national data sets to underpin all this. So thanks very much. Thank you for giving me more than the 10 minutes you proposed, but I really thought I should take you through that full presentation because it probably does answer some preliminary questions, and now you can dig in to the detail.
We'll go to Mike first and then to Steve.
Cheers, I've got a couple of these, right?
You want to, Sue?
Where's all the LUC 5 gone?
Sorry?
Where's all the LUC 5? I can't believe that there's only in that table on.
There's very little
I
LUC
struggle
5.
that there's that amount of LUC 5.
It's always been the case.
Yeah.
And
It
I'm
has
not,
to do with the historical classification criteria when they
Yeah.
did it, and how the criteria for classifying that LUC 5 were kind of designed. Maybe this is also the kind of hangover from the US application, because the whole system came from the United States at the time, and maybe this is to do with that.
it's just a quirk. It's
Yeah,
always been
yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, and it's an observation as well, and we've talked about this previously, is, with the LUC classes, it is very blunt and very broad, and it doesn't take into account the live changes that happen all the time.
No,
It's
exactly.
a biological system.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not just irrigation. T-Beretta North, the Rakaia Bridge, was merino weather country back in the day. It was all riverbed. Now there's 6-8 inches of topsoil. It's completely different soil type because of that investment. And we see that on our hill country farms as well. And people have, talk about LUC 6 and 7 as unproductive. It's far more productive than what it was 30 and 40 years ago due to fertiliser inputs, rotational grazing, regenerative farming, Steve. But that's literally
No,
what
that's
we've been
right.
doing.
That's exactly right.
And it's far more productive, and it's evidenced by our national lambing percentage and live weight of lambs and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So you look at that system broadly, and it says that's unproductive. Actually, that's not the case because it's evolved, and it will continue to evolve.
Yeah. This just hasn't kept up.
Yeah.
That's really the point.
Steve.
Have you hazarded any sort of guess on what it would cost?
Oh. No, I haven't. And it's like anything else. It's as long as a piece of string, Steve, because you can always add more and there'll be diminishing returns. Look, perhaps rather than speculate now, let me tell you, I've got a report coming to Parliament around the middle of the year. So it's before you all go electioneering, and it is really pulling a lot of the stuff together and looking at some of the technologies that could be game changers, because you know what they did back in the 1950s, you know, there was a hell of a lot of bods on the ground having to go out and do stuff. I mean, these days with remote sensing, you just pick up gobs of information which they could not have done then. So what I'm going to do is give Parliament an idea of how some technologies could change the game. So that's going to be my last pitch on this. You know, after almost a decade of making this point, I mean, someone has to pick this up. My advice to the government, to two governments, has been you should establish a task force. You need to give leadership to a single agency. It could be LINS, it could be MFE, it could be statistics, but a data-based entity. You know, leadership, sit down, look at the array of data sets, look at where the gaps are, look at what could be integrated in what order, look at the technologies that could move you forward faster in the places that need it most, and then develop a plan over, say, a decade to try to change the game. But you will never do this unless you actually decide that you're going to do it in a systemic way.
Can I just jump in there? And this is a point we've made to the Environment Select Committee in the context of RM reform. But yes, there is an upfront cost to the Crown of this, but there's long-term savings for New Zealand Inc. as well. You know, people putting in resource consents are spending millions of dollars in some cases. And it's incredibly expensive, and making this upfront investment will make that process cheaper. You know, you're moving to a more permissive system. There will be an upfront cost to this investment, but we have to think about how we claw this back with small charges on all of these new permitted uses or consents that exist under the new system, to be able to recover that investment over time.
Sorry, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the clawback?
Well, because, you know, the Crown will need to spend money up front on this, but people are going to be saving money in the cost of putting in consents under the new system. They'll be saving a lot of money because a lot of the information they've previously had to go to the PROs and procure will be provided for them.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay.
So it'll be free.
So instead of paying $20,000 to a soil scientist to get you consent, that will be covered under this.
Well, the government is talking about, you know, cost recovery for that system, which is entirely fair. But if the cost recovery is part of a system which is dramatically reducing the costs over time, then it's a no-brainer. I mean, look, I don't know about you. This is what I thought that one of the core functions of governments, actually. This is before you start spending, you know, money on consumption and other items. This is a core investment any government of any political colour should be committing to make.
That's what they knew in the 50s.
Yes, they did actually know that in the 1950s. That was the state of the art then.
Yeah.
That was the state of the art then. It's just that we haven't kept the state of the art up.
So there's a couple of subs from Sue's and then.
Oh, in terms of the measurement, like, it's because you could measure irrigated land, but that's actually different. So you've got sand country, for example.
Sure.
And it's one class of land when it's just raw sand country, but then once you've put irrigation on it, it's a different class. So how do you sort of rationalise that? Is it the latest? Is this the latest thing when you measure it?
No, but hang on.
Or that doesn't change it.
It's not.
Doesn't change the LUC doesn't change no matter what you add.
No,
to
the
it.
LUC doesn't change, George.
Right. So
At
it's
present,
the raw, it's what's underneath.
we've got to get beyond this. You know, we can't think about this as a single data platform where there's just one index that tells you everything. This is layers of information. So, you know, LUC will be in there. It's always been there. It provides a purpose. But then you can overlay that with soil. You can overlay that with climate. You know, you can overlay that with any number. I mean, when we did our work for Going with the Grain in Southland, the person we were working with, Clint Risman, his data layers, the 14 different data layers he was using, and he was integrating 14 layers to say these are the leakier areas, these are the less leaky areas, you know, in terms of nutrient and so on. So it was much, much more fine grained. So you've got to think about it as multiple data sets that then you assemble on a bespoke basis for the purpose in hand. So when the government wanted to do what it did with forestry, it would have actually gone out there and used accurate data layers which made sense. They'd have been about slope, they'd have been about, the landslide potential, they'd have been about productivity, yeah, that's part of it. Probably wind direction, all sorts of things. You could put all of that together and say, okay, these are the areas where we don't want to see forestry.
So a consistent approach. And then the only other thing I was going to say was that when you talk, I totally agree with you on reducing the 500 metre down to 50 metres. But the technology's there now. Like I know when we're applying fertiliser, they can modify it 1 metre and 1 metre square blocks. They put more on here and less on here. So that
It's just, it is a question of just, it's more data. Yeah, no, quite so.
Thank you.
And more recent data sets that we've showed in terms of the erosion ones, those highly susceptible land and the connectivity to waterways, they all are high resolution. So not 1 to 500 meters, but 1 to 50,000 or like 50 meters.
1 to 50 metres.
Yeah, not 1 to 500,
Yeah,
but
1 to 50, yeah.
50.
But what Susie's saying is, in fact,
Yeah.
you can go below that. It's just a question of how much data you want to gather to analyse,
You can get a tractor to put fertiliser on your paddock in 1 metre block, so it needs a bit more there, less there. So
Yep.
So you've got
You
the
could
supplement
potentially
to.
lifetime, as you put fertiliser on, or you go from unirrigated to irrigated, it just changes. It's lifetime that continually evolves, couldn't you? I just had a question around, you had, the detail in the Hawke's Bay there.
Yeah.
Have you got a sense of the percentage of New Zealand where all that information is actually available to be able to do what you did?
Well, data set by data set, we know. We haven't put them all together to see what you'd know, but certainly for SMAP, which was the more sophisticated of the two, that, as I said, it's 70% of productive land. Do you know what the LiDAR numbers are?
No, but there are, it's probably slightly higher,
It's
but
even
there
higher.
are really gaps for
yeah,
LiDAR.
we saw that when we did a review of that. Was it last year? Remember, it had big gaps around certain.
Yeah, around Vanuatu,
Yes, you're in the black spot.
I know. Yeah.
Aotearoa,
Yeah.
and then Fiordland. These are the LiDAR
That's
gaps.
why I remember it.
Yes, and I mean, yes, Fiordland's important, but if you were prioritising, it's where you're under the greatest pressure, the greatest stress,
We'd
that's where
do a
you put your
Tiger,
investment.
Fiordland, then maybe the Manawatu.
But on highly productive land, so in terms of the methodology, where essentially the Ministry for the Environment currently has a project, and we mentioned it in the report, they essentially commissioned BSI to produce that layer of what could be highly productive land, basically those maps from Hawke's Bay that we've showed. And they're trying to do it for all of the areas where there is this SMAP coverage. At least, and with the idea that will inform identification of highly productive land. Obviously, that doesn't work in terms of erosion because there are gaps there, but on the flat land where essentially SMAP covers that, and that's like 78% of that highly productive land, that's kind of the idea. So the equivalence of those Hawke's Bay maps, they're currently being worked through by MFE for a larger area of the country.
We're not starting from nowhere. I mean, that's the good news.
Yeah.
We're not starting from nowhere. It is a question of having a commitment
Yeah.
to pick up what we've got, integrate it into an integrated architecture. That's the policy decision that's missing.
That's sort of like, why wouldn't you do it? You kind of, it's a total no-brainer. My question is, are you across the government's decision to take LUC 3 out of the national policy statement on highly productive land, so that it's no longer protected from urban sprawl and development, the cabinet decision in December last year?
No, I'm not.
But part of the context of it is they express an intention, I don't have the document in front of me, to do a more thorough analysis of the LUC 3. And before they determine which bits of it should really be protected. I just wonder if that could be a specific opportunity to apply some of what you've deduced as the problem.
It could be.
And
It could be. Like my instinct is that we don't want to keep getting distracted by oh dear, we've got a regulatory issue. Let's specifically see what we can work on here.
Yeah.
There is a bigger prize here.
Yeah.
Because, look, so the government, suppose it looks at LUC 3, you can bet there'll be some LUC 2, which isn't LUC 2.
Yeah.
I mean, where somebody's disadvantaged.
Yeah.
I actually think the big prize is to work on trying to sort this out
The whole
more
thing.
systemically.
Yeah.
And probably more, again, like picking up on that last recommendation 4, that's really more targeted information gathering, i.e. greater mapping in the areas of pressure,
Yeah.
i.e. In there, there's going to be the interactions of LUC, especially 2 and 3. But say take the Napier Hastings area that's been shown, or other urban and sprawling centers. That kind of focus will be more on that, and it makes sense to sort of do more granular mapping there, not just focus on one specific bit.
Yeah.
So,
No, you go.
because you would want as many layers as possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Because an example from where I'm from, there's an orchard that's been built out around, and they cannot, because of reverse sensitivity, they cannot operate profitably as they used to, because they're not allowed to use the sprays or what have you. People complain about the noise, but they can't subdivide either.
No, but this is a really serious problem. I mean, councils, again, I think this pervades everything. You end up drawing lines on maps.
Yeah.
And I don't blame councils. They use what information they've got. And I see this in my own case, that, well, it's class this. And to which I say, well, actually, look, you could easily be rid of that, because that's clearly not in there. But that's not what the information says. Councils, it's too complicated and expensive then to start picking and choosing. So you end up with the lowest common denominator in a way. So, in your case, I'd have said that's just a no-brainer to get that right. But that's probably there, to be honest with you, I don't think you're probably up against information problems. You're just up against subdivisional rules.
Yeah.
Which no longer make sense. If it's completely surrounded by houses, then, well,
And they've
can't
spent
pretend
a
there's a
fortune
distance.
trying to have
Yeah.
reclassification, but they haven't got there at all. So it's a bit unfortunate.
I mean, the government's proposed reform, I think in this respect, is potentially a good one. Spatial planning, which says, look, if we're going to have urban growth, then what direction's it going to go into? What density? And you can identify the areas that you want to keep free of housing, either because it's very, very highly productive and there's reverse sensitivity, and or because there's hazard risk, from floodplain, all of this stuff. I think that's a really good idea. It's not a new idea. It's been done already in parts of New Zealand, but doing that comprehensively makes a lot of sense. But to do it well, and where you get into trouble is where somebody comes along and says, we've just decided this is the 27 growth limit line. And you think, hold it, you've just included my place and it's got none of those characteristics. But they say, well, that's what the data says, you see? So if you want to make this work in a way that people will accept, okay, got to be some trade-offs. There'll be some areas where you can and some areas where you can't. You can they won't agree on everything, but at least if the information tells the same story, they'll go with it. But it's where people find a massive gap between their lived experience and what some data set from the past said.
So,
I just on the other hand, I guess I was just thinking that, like, could you also use this to increase the productivity of some land? Because you could say, right, we've got some land here, but without any environmental damage, like it doesn't need too much water or it doesn't need this, that you could actually increase the productivity of the land. So you could determine other bits of land that we aren't using necessarily for food production that could be brought into the equation.
That's very much what we were trying to say with going with the grain, that you need to look at this at the level of catchments, and you need to identify the most at-risk areas, and that's where you need to spend your money. Now, the flip side of that is there are areas where it doesn't make sense to be spending money or restricting production in the same way. So you end up with a much more sophisticated, but it's all going to add up at the end of the day, let's be honest. What ends up at the river at the bottom and goes into the estuary, the quality of that there's only a certain amount of carrying capacity. But currently, I don't think we are using our carrying capacity well because of the coarseness of that information. So rules are hurting some people more than they need to, and they're not tough enough for others.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Steve.
Thank you for your presentation.
So the three pieces of legislation that currently rely on the LUC, I mean, how problematic is that from a efficacy point of view and also a fairness point of view? And therefore, if we're going to keep passing pieces of legislation that use LUC, isn't there a sort of critical urgency around this?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, it is very unfair to people who have had land which, for the purposes of the regulation, is, I don't say misclassified, it's classified for the purposes of LUC, but it isn't classified for the purposes of regulation. It's extremely unfair. So, yeah, there's a real urgency. I should remind you, I'm not sure whether we came to this committee or whether it was environment, but we warned the House, we warned the government. We said when they were trying to restrict forestry on Class 6-7 land, we warned them of the dangers here, that it wasn't good enough. You'd be much better to amend the ETS, but that's another matter.
Yeah, no, any further questions? So, thanks, Simon.
Real pleasure.
Our catchment group did a wee project a while back using LiDAR, and we were going down 3 metres into the soil. And that information was really, really useful because what we were doing on a pilot scheme in one area, what we thought was, the standard operating procedure for environmental stuff, turned out we spent $200,000 or something planting and blah, blah, blah. And we would have been better off spending a fraction of that, just putting a few bunds in along a intermittent waterway, and that would have given us far better result than, and we only found that out when we did the LiDAR stuff.
Well, that's ground penetrating radar to go down below.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen this in I think in Susie's area where people have been using bunds in ephemeral waterways, and that was all based on very sophisticated soil mapping, wasn't it? In an area where there wasn't soil map, so they got Massey and they got AgResearch to go and do all of this work for a quite small area because there was a gap. And they were very proud to show it off to me. And I said, look, this is really great, but what about the poor guy who owns the farm over the fence? Because the information was literally just for experimental,
Well, but it's fascinating the technologies that are available now can lead you to make better decisions.
Yeah. And what's more, I'll tell you this, I mean, you'll know this from catchment groups. You give people this information and they're fascinated. I mean, it really is. It's a real hook to get people interested in managing the land better.
They want to do it right, but it's difficult without the right information.
No, they're environmentally focused.
Well, and let's be honest, many are, not everybody. I mean, there are some people who don't want to know anything.
People in catchment groups are.
Yeah, but catchment groups, I agree, absolutely. All right. Well, we hope you can help push this forward because we've been campaigning on this one, on information, for a long time, and I think it's something which Parliament as a whole should be able to agree on.
Yeah, well, we do. We'll make a recommendation right now, won't we?
Look,
Maybe we should write a letter.
Yeah, we've certainly all got an interest in this.
Yeah.
Obviously, which is why we had you to come in.
Well, thank you. We're
Thank
very
you very
pleased to
much.
come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
These slides.